Good morning. My name is Anita Weisbach. I was born in Vienna, Austria. I had a wonderful childhood. Here's a picture of my family, loving parents, brother and sister. As I said, I was the youngest of three. Went on vacation, went to places and had a wonderful life. Here's a picture of a school outing on vacation. This is the last picture I took still in Vienna. Everything was beautiful because Vienna is a beautiful city. Went to vacation all summer long and just had everything a child possibly needs until the day Hitler marched into Austria, which was March the 13th, 1938. You could see the picture how the police had to hold the people back when Hitler came through Vienna. They were all had their swastika armbands ready, and the swastika flags were flying from all the buildings. They were all ready to welcome Hitler into Austria. They were marching and chanting, Hitler awake, Jude verrecke. That means Hitler awake, Jews perish. That was the end of my childhood, the way I know it. Overnight, to become a non-person. In Germany, Hitler was already in power for a few years. So every year another law came out. You couldn't go to school, couldn't go to the university, couldn't go to a movie. You couldn't even sit on a bench in the park. In Austria, within 24 hours, all those laws were in place. Right next door, I had a girlfriend living. She was Catholic, and we went to school together, played together. I used to be in her house decorating Christmas trees. She was in my house eating vegetable soup. There was never any difference. We respected our religion. But that all changed once the Anschluss, when Hitler marched into Austria. You know, Jews have been living in Austria for hundreds of years. They were pillars of the community, had a wonderful, carefree life, and that all changed. As I said, my friend Mitzi next door, she was afraid to talk to me because if somebody sees her being with me, they could denounce her and they could arrest her for being with a Jewish girl. So everything changed. Of course, then came Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. Was November the 9th and 10th. They burned all the synagogues in Vienna, except one they couldn't burn because it was in a very narrow street attached to the house. They're afraid the whole block might burn. But they used that stable for the horses, for their horses. Now, my mother realized she has to, they came to our home, arrested my father, who ended up in Dachau concentration camp, smashed some furniture, helped themselves to whatever they want. Now, you would think you called the police. You couldn't, because they were one of them. There was absolutely nothing you could do. My sister and I were just afraid they should hurt my mother after they took my father away. My mother realized that she has to save her children. She has to do something. My brother was already in his early 20s. His so-called friends were going to come for him. So he went illegally over the border to France. He lived in Paris. Well, in Europe, you needed identity papers. Of course, he had none. One day it was the French police who stopped him for papers. As he had none, they were going to send him back. You can just imagine what would happen if they sent him back. So he joined the French Foreign Legion and ended up in Africa. And during the war, when the British came to North Africa, he joined the British Army and were fighting the Nazis. Now, Hitler waited after Christmas night. How will the world react? Thousands of boys and men were taken to concentration camps. Jewish businesses were looted. That's why it's called the Night of the Broken Glass. But the world was quiet. So Hitler knew he can do what he wants to do, and he surely did it. But there was one country who had some compassion. That was England. Right after Christmas night, they had the debate in Parliament. What could they do? They decided to take in an unspecified number of children. They had to be under 17 years of age and come alone. That was called the Kindertransport. Now, in December, the first transport came to England. Until just before war broke out, 10,000 children were saved. 90% of all those children never saw their parents again. My aunt, who had four children, had a violent argument with my mother. She called my mother a hot mother. How can you send your children away? How can you do that? You know, until I became a mother, did I realize they're both right. What does a mother want to do? Hold your clothes, right? But I truly believe my mother gave birth to me twice. When I was born, and when she had the strength and the foresight to send me on the Kindertransport. You know, it's very difficult for you to understand because today, with social media, internet, television, you know what happens in the world instantly. We didn't have that. I had no idea where England was. Never met an English person. It was very scary. I know the day I left was March 13, 1939. I only remember the date because it was the first anniversary of Hitler marching into Austria. There were parades, there was flags flying, there was jubilation. I remember being in the train, the windows tightly closed. I'm inside, my mother outside. For 4 agonizing hours, that train stood there. I'm inside, my mother outside. I was afraid to step away from the window. I was afraid I would lose her forever. You know, that's over 80 years ago. And to this day, I can't stand anybody seeing me off. It left that impression on me. I don't remember how many children were on the train, but there were little ones, 2-year-old and 3-year-old, who had no idea what happened to them. They just cried for their mothers. They grew up in England as nice boys and girls, and if somebody survived and came for them, they couldn't even remember them because they were so young. And of course, we didn't know the language. We didn't know who's going to take care of us. And we always worried of the ones we left behind. We tried to talk ourselves into it that it is an adventure, that it will be a new experience. But believe me, looking at each other, we were very scared what is going to happen. Most children had wonderful experiences. The British people really opened up their, their homes and gave them what they need. Some children were exploited, but at least we were free. I remember the train went to Germany to the border of Holland. The Nazis came in and yelled at us if anyone had smuggled anything. We were only allowed a small suitcase, only personal belongings, nothing of value. Then we went over the border to Holland and we felt free. There were ladies on the platform to give us hot chocolate and sandwiches. That was the first time I ever saw white bread. But at least we were free, but always worried who's going to take care of us. I don't remember how long it took for me to learn English, but I had no choice. I had to learn it. And the people who took in the children were responsible until they were 18 years of age. Then I went to London, had to find a job and make a life for myself. We are telling you the story of the Holocaust to show you where hate can lead to. Don't be a bystander. If you see something, speak up. If more people might have spoken up, it might never have happened. Be an upstander. Speak up. You are the next generation. It is up to you. It should never happen to another child again. Thank you.
Just to let you all know, if you would like a copy of this recording, please let us know. Our first survivor was Anita Weisbach. We first want to wish her an early happy birthday. She's turning 99. If you noticed in the picture behind Anita, our first survivor, that was the actual Nazis entering Vienna. As Anita said, she was born in Vienna, was there witnessing the annexing of Austria, as well as was a participant in the Kinder transport to England as a child. And as you heard her call to action, we can't be bystanders, we must be upstanders. Our next survivor is Renee Silver, who was born in the German state of Saarland. During the Holocaust, Renee and her sister were hidden in the Protestant community of Le Chambon, France. And as you see behind her, a couple, it was Andre and Magda Trocame, two Jesuits, where they and their community of Le Chambon saved over 5,000 Jews.
The Holocaust was a descent into hell, in which millions perished in acts aided and abetted by millions, not only in Germany, but in countries defeated and annexed by the Germans, and even in countries far removed, such as the United States, who refused to hear the cries of despair and offer asylum. Yet, there were those who had the courage to care, despite in many cases the danger to their own lives and to the lives of their families. In 1945, at war's end, my immediate family, mother, father, little sister Edith, and I slowly realized that we were the only survivors left in Europe. Some family members had emigrated to Brazil and to the United States before the war. The rest, my grandfather, uncles, aunts, cousins on both sides of my parents, had been exterminated in extermination camps throughout Europe. How did the four of us survive? When France was defeated and divided into occupied and unoccupied France, we found ourselves in Virbagne, just outside of Lyon, in occupied France. This was also known as Vichy France, as the town of Vichy was its capital under the leadership of the aging Maréchal Philippe Pétain. Pétain's first official act was to create a special ministry to deal with la question juive, the Jewish question. Pierre Laval, a known, virulent anti-Semite, was put in charge of this new ministry. Armies of lawyers went to work to determine who was a Jew and in which ways Jews would be dealt with. Jews were no longer allowed to into certain restaurants, into certain parks, public areas. They were not allowed to pursue education for the intellectually gifted. The study of law, medicine, engineering were all prohibited to them. Concentration camps sprang up throughout France. While they were not extermination camps, they were portals to such camps. French police rounded up the Jews, French military guarded them, and French railroads were used to transport them to the extermination camps. While these new edicts became the law of the land, there were a few who stood up and expressed their humanity. The pastor of a small Huguenot community in the Massif Central was one of these giants. André Trocmé was a pacifist. As soon as the new laws were proclaimed, he preached a sermon outside of his temple in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where in his sonorous voice, he proclaimed, we shall fight with the weapons of the Spirit. He galvanized not only his immediate flock of parishioners, but with the help of like-minded religious leaders and teachers in the region, enabled a network of rescuers. Some 2,500 people saved the lives of some 5,000 Jewish children and young people. The area where this occurred is somewhat cut off from the rest of France. At the end of the 16th century, during the war between Catholics and Protestants, many Protestants fled France, and many settled on this hard-to-reach plateau in southwestern France. They were called the Huguenots. In 1942, these Huguenots, as well as other Christians in the region, defied the new French laws, risking their own lives and the lives of their families. They were sincerely religious, conscious of the sanctity of human life. They believed the laws of the Old Testament and followed them to the letter. Often the code word for a Jew was a New Testament. My little sister Edith, then 9, and I, 11, were saved by being taken to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, although we were only too young to even know why we were there. We thought we were going to the mountains and did not really understand that we were being hidden until it became apparent that we would be separated, and were told we could not write to our parents or receive mail from them. During that same period, my parents' lives were saved by the action of individuals who acted entirely on their own. My best friend was Renée Cossidière. Her parents were the janitors of a large municipal complex in Villeurbanne, where we lived. The complex housed a municipal clinic, theater, swimming pool, official offices, and an apartment for the Cossidières. In July 1942, the offices in this municipal building were being used to house the Pétain police, counterpart of the German Gestapo, and sent to the area to pick up the Jews. These roundups were called rafles, meaning raids. They usually took place at night when it was more likely to find the Jews in their homes. One morning, Monsieur Cossidière overheard the policemen gleefully announce to each other, "This is it. We're going to get them all tonight." He knew exactly what they meant. While he had never met my parents, he knew I was Jewish and he knew where I lived. Without hesitating 1 second, he spoke to his wife and walked over to my parents' apartment, rang the bell, identified himself, and explained his reason for being there. Without hesitating, my parents followed him. Indeed, that very evening, my parents watched as their friends and neighbors were loaded onto trucks and buses across the square from the municipal building where they were hiding. The Cossidières had no church affiliation. They were simply good human beings who recognized their opportunity to save 2 other human beings' lives. Had they hesitated or deliberated, it would have been too late. I would like to add that my father was totally paralyzed on his left side from a World War I brain injury. Under no circumstance could he have survived deportation to a concentration camp. His devoted wife, my mother, could not have survived seeing him suffer. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon is a unique place where members of different Christian faiths, inspired by Pastor André Trocmé, protected, hid, and saved a large number of Jewish children. The Quakers, people like Werner Fry, members of the Unitarian Universalists, helped. In other parts of France, individuals of the Catholic Church saved numerous lives, creating baptismal certificates and new identities for Jewish children. The distance between the commission of evil and the willingness to turn away and ignore it is not very great in the eyes of the just. To pretend it doesn't or didn't exist is evil too. We are all members of the human race and responsible for each other. Over the temple of the Le Chambon church are written the words, "Aimez-vous les uns les autres," love one another. I would like to finish by quoting Elie Wiesel. Remember that it is easy to save human lives. One did not need to be heroic or crazy to feel pity for an abandoned child. It was enough to open a door, to throw a piece of bread, a shirt, a coin. It was enough to feel compassion. In those times, one climbed to the summit of humanity by simply remaining human.
Thank you, Renee. Again, we want to wish you an early happy 91st birthday. Our final survivor is Werner Wright. Werner and his family were residents of Berlin, Germany when the Nazis came to power. After 2 years in the concentration camp, Werner was sent on the death march. Notice behind Werner is an artifact that he donated to our museum. And of course, if you would like to know more information about Werner, you can go to TED.com. You can go to TED.com and watch a TED presentation of Werner Reich. Thank you, Werner.
When I was 14 years old, I got sentenced to death. I wasn't the only one who got sentenced to death on that particular day. Roughly 10,000 European Jews got sentenced as well. During the next 3 years, they were murdered at the rate of roughly 2 million per year. I was one of the few who managed to survive. But it wasn't only Jews who were persecuted. It was also Christians and Muslims. Altogether, roughly 12 million people were murdered during the Holocaust. Entire towns were wiped out, and people were shot strictly because the Nazis thought that they cooperated with the resistance. People were herded into churches, and then the churches were set on fire. When I was 15 years old, I was arrested and taken over a period of several months through jails and ended up in concentration camps. And eventually I ended up in the Auschwitz concentration camp, which by that time, when I arrived in 1944, had already murdered 1 million people by placing them into gas chambers or shooting them. To me, it is still a mystery why people think it is funny when they paint swastikas, not realizing that the swastika is a symbol of death and torture and destruction. Whenever I talk to students who had painted swastikas, I ask them, why did you paint a swastika? And they said it was a joke. But I fail to see a joke where people are herded into churches and then set on fire. I fail to see a joke where people are forced to dig ditches, then lined up and being shot, or where people are being forced to work until they are dead. I ended up in the Auschwitz concentration camp, and by some sheer miracle escaped the murder one day when out of 6,000 people, 89 of us were selected not to be killed. And I stayed in Auschwitz for the next couple of months, for about 3-4 months. And then in January 1945, Germany was starting to lose the war against Russia, and the Russian soldiers advanced. And most German concentration camps were in Poland. And for some reason, which still escapes me, they tried to move most of the prisoners into Germany or Austria or some other places west from the Russians. I don't know whether they wanted to use us for labor or whether they wanted to hide the fact that they had concentration camps. And so in January 1945, most of the prisoners in the Auschwitz concentration camps were sent on a death march. We were given a piece of bread and we were told to start walking. There were 60,000 of us. It was the coldest winter in the 20th century. There was snow and ice on the roads. There was absolutely nothing to keep us warm. We had clothing made out of dish towels, and we had no fat on ourselves, and we had no socks or anything like that. And so we started to walk, and we walked for a couple of hours, and then we stopped and we sat down, and those who couldn't get up afterwards were shot. And this went on for the entire day. There was no food there. We were given a slice of bread at the beginning of the trip, and we put it in our pockets. And after an hour or so, the bread froze to a solid chunk of ice. The first night we slept in some stables and people were fighting for space anywhere. I ended up sleeping between the legs of a cow. There were maybe a dozen cows lined up. And the next morning, when we tried to leave, one of the SS-men fired a couple of shots to a big haystack. Some couple of people tried to hide in the haystack and they were killed by these shots. And so we continued our march. And this time, by the second day, people were getting weaker and weaker, and they were falling down, they were crying, they were begging, but for me and others to help them. But there was absolutely no way that I could help a person because I myself had great difficulty walking. I still hear these cries of help today, and that's something like 80 years, 70 years later. We continued that day and we ended up on a big concrete silo, and we were forced to sleep on this concrete. It was like sleeping on an ice block. It was exceedingly cold and we were completely numb the next morning. And then we continued, and towards the evening, we ended up at a railroad siding, and there were big coal cars lined up. And we were told to get into these coal cars. So far for the last 3 days, we haven't had any food, and the only water which we had was snow and ice, which we ate from the road. Of the 60,000 who traveled, who walked these 3 days, we walked roughly 23 miles, 15,000 were dead, 15,000 out of the 3,000, as out of the 60,000. We were loaded in the cars and then we started traveling. And while it was cold when we walked, at least we moved our blood. It was extremely, extremely cold while we were in these railroad cars because the wind of the cars made us even colder as the train was moving, and we couldn't move. I remember the first day and a half being in these railroad cars, and then for the next 2.5 days, I can't remember a thing. I must have passed out. We were there 4 days, and after 4 days, we ended up in the Mauthausen concentration camp. We tried to get out of the railroad cars, those of us who were still alive, and we could barely walk. I had a feeling I was walking on tennis balls. I just couldn't stand properly. I was tottering back and forth, and so were the others. And then we ended up in the camp, which wasn't too far from the railroad tracks, and we were showered. And then we collapsed, screaming with pain, because all of us were frostbitten. After about 3 days, my feet started to rot. And there was a prisoner in the camp who was a doctor before the war. And he just cut off my toes on one foot and part of the toes on the other foot, just to save my life. He had some paper, which he used as bandage, and that was that. And then things got really, really bad because there was no food there. The SS had abandoned us. Nobody dared to get into the camp. Diseases were spreading through the camp, and people were dying like flies. There were huge stacks of dead bodies all over the camp. Some of these stacks were slightly moving, and we were sleeping in our own feces and in urine. We hadn't washed or cleaned for 5 months. The stench was incredible. I know a GI who liberated us, and he said he could smell the camp 10 miles away. On the 5th of May, that year, we were liberated by American forces, and I hitchhiked back to Yugoslavia, where there was communism there. I managed to escape and get to England. And from there, after 9 years, I managed to get to the United States. The question which is very often asked is, could the Holocaust, could all this murder, could all this tragedy have been avoided? And the answer is yes. If the German, the Czech, the Hungarian, if all of these people would have opened their mouths and said, no, we don't want this, there would not have been a Holocaust. But instead of doing that, they either ignored it or they assisted. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need help, you can ask your friends, and they will maybe help you, but that's not enough. You have to be assured that that help is there. So let us listen to the words of Dr. Martin Luther King when he said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. When you know that a friend is in need, that this friend needs help, open your mouth, stretch out your hand. Please, don't be a silent friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today. If you would like more information, please contact us at www.hmtc.li.org. In closing, I would like to quote the late Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, Nobel laureate. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's the indifference to life and death. As all of our survivors said, we cannot remain silent. As the brilliant Martin Luther King said, quoted by Werner, Wright, we cannot remain silent. It is all of your responsibility to combat injustice by not remaining indifferent. Thank you for joining us today.